Good morning. My name is Chris Viezda. I serve as the minister of Belvidere Church of Christ. This presentation is the next in a series entitled Apostolic Churches of Christ, Ancient Faith, Enduring Wisdom, Sacred Story, Future Hope. The title of this presentation is Churches of Christ, Worship and Instrumental Music. Some of you may be members of a church associated with the Churches of Christ. Some of you may be outsiders who are familiar with aspects of our immediate brotherhood. Either way, you understand that this topic has been a delicate and even divisive matter within Churches of Christ. There are many excellent resources which one can consult on this matter. Some of these I have listed in the description text of this presentation. I do not expect that what I share will serve as some sort of final and supremely compelling word on this matter. My intention is to offer a relatively brief but hopefully helpful framework by which some may be able to understand why a shift has been occurring within some of the Churches of Christ. Now, Churches of Christ emerged from an early 19th century restoration movement led by men like Thomas and Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone, and Walter Scott. It was about a century after the launch of this Stone-Campbell movement that Churches of Christ were finally recognized as a distinct brotherhood in the 1906 U.S. Census. Throughout the 20th century, Churches of Christ enjoyed periods of significant growth. We were known for worship that was exclusively a cappella. Well, why is this? A dominant doctrine among Churches of Christ was that musical instruments in public worship were not authorized by the Bible. Debate over instruments in worship contributed to a divided movement. These Churches of Christ, by and large, withdrew fellowship from other restorationist congregations that referred to themselves as Christian churches, disciples of Christ, and also as Churches of Christ. By the mid-1800s, these other churches had begun to introduce instruments into their public worship. As for the anti-instrumental Churches of Christ, they opposed what they regarded as an unscriptural innovation contrary to the will of God. Stone-Campbell Restorationism was a back-to-the-Bible movement shaped by the common-sense rationalism of the Enlightenment and applying a Baconian method of biblical study. The goal was to discern a pattern of New Testament Christianity as a basis for a more unified church. From this patternist approach developed, among other things, an anti-instrumentalism that many found to be compelling. Anti-instrumental brethren insisted that a study of the New Testament reveals divine directives for Christians to sing songs in public worship that are to be accompanied only by the melody of a thankful heart. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. Anti-instrumental brethren have applied as well 2 John 1:9 to this matter. Here we read that the Apostle John declares that those who go beyond, neglecting to continue in the teaching of Christ, are not of God, having neither the Father nor the Son. Anti-instrumental brethren have asserted that worship accompanied by instruments is this very sort of sin that goes beyond the teaching of Christ and separates believers from God. In the Gospel of John, chapter 17, Jesus prayed for the unity of his followers. However, church history is a sad story of division. Various ways of worship have been one of those divisive issues. Many believers today would regard debate and division over the use of instruments in public worship as being pointless and absurd at best. After all, for generations, many, at least in the West, have experienced worship that includes musical instruments. Many grew up in churches where the singing was accompanied by pianos or organs. Songs of faith and worship featuring vocals, drums, bass, guitars, and keys are the recordings heard on radio stations dedicated to Christian content. Praise bands that play many of these newer songs heard on Christian radio or at Christian concert events are now common throughout much of the church. Instruments in worship are so common, at least in the West, that their absence can seem odd to many. However, the absence of instruments within churches of Christ has been a matter of conviction. For those who oppose instruments in worship, a strictly a cappella format is a matter of being faithful to God. Acquiescing to willful presumptions of merely human traditions would be the sin of going beyond the doctrine of Christ. Again, 2 John 1:9. The same sort of sin as is the making of additions to the words of sacred Scripture. Revelation 22, verses 7, 9, 17 to 19. Deuteronomy 4:2. Deuteronomy 12:32 and Proverbs 30, verses 5 to 6. Anti-instrumental brethren can cite Matthew 15, 8 to 9 and Colossians 2, 21 to 23 to insist upon the vanity and futility of holding to human traditions that are elevated to the status of divine commands. Such human traditions that are held to be contrary to the plain will of God as conveyed through Scripture. I pray that you all bear with me. I'm struggling a little bit this morning with maybe a mid-spring cold, something like that. So my voice isn't quite there. So again, appreciate you hanging in there and bearing with me so far. Well, we continue. The imperative of obeying God rather than merely men and their human traditions has also been proclaimed by churches of Christ when referring to Acts 4:19 and Acts 5:29. Churches of Christ have offered Nadab and Abihu as Old Testament examples of the consequences of engaging in unauthorized forms of worship. These two priests were destroyed for deviating from the prescribed parameters for tabernacle worship. Leviticus 10, verses 1 to 11. Now, a good deal of the growth enjoyed by churches of Christ may be due to their persuading of other believers that they were in danger of God's wrath, since their churches, like Nadab and Abihu, offered unauthorized worship to God that featured both vocal and forbidden instrumental music. These other believers were urged to leave their false denominational churches to gather as a member of the Lord's true church, in which they would be blessed with the firm assurance of salvation by properly worshiping God in spirit and truth. John 4:23 to 24. Put simply, an a cappella approach to worship was not merely offered as a best practice to other believers. a cappella worship was set forth by anti-instrumental churches of Christ as a condition of both fellowship and salvation. Anti-instrumental brethren have also pointed to church history. For the centuries following Pentecost that we read about in Acts chapter 2, worship without instruments appears to have been the norm. Ancient church leaders wrote of their opposition to instruments in worship. Even most of Eastern Orthodoxy has remained a cappella for many centuries. The very term a cappella itself is offered as evidence of an ancient anti-instrumentalism. The term a cappella means to sing in the manner of the chapel, to sing in the manner of the church. Anti-instrumental brethren will therefore insist that the much later introduction of instruments into worship is a deviation from the New Testament pattern of pure apostolic Christianity. It seems that anti-instrumental doctrine within churches of Christ is also a relic of Calvinism. John Calvin formulated the regulative principle. One may say that Calvin's principle requires New Testament commands and examples for the proper conduct of the public congregational worship of God. John Calvin's commentaries, tracts, and institutes helped to shape much of the Reformation. Founders of the Stone Campbell Restoration movement were influenced by Reformed theology and methods of Calvin and his successors. And this is not surprising, since many, if not most, of the early founders of the Restoration movement came from the Presbyterian Reformed tradition. Now, knowingly or not, the churches of Christ followed Calvin's regulative principle as a method of interpretation. By this, they pieced together their pattern for the practice of a pure New Testament apostolic faith. In their application of Calvin's regulative principle, many in churches of Christ agreed with Calvin that a New Testament study revealed not one command or example of instrumental music in congregational worship. Furthermore, it may be said that many in churches of Christ expanded upon Calvin's regulative principle, claiming that there were neither any necessary inferences that could be drawn from the New Testament text that could authorize instrumental music in the public worship services of a local church. Some suggest that the Civil War was also a factor, that churches of Christ in the South were far too depleted to fund the introduction of the expensive instruments which the Northern Restorationist churches could afford. This, coupled with a smoldering resentment towards the destructive outcome of Northern aggression, may factor into an abiding and firm anti-instrument tradition. Now, taking all of this into consideration, why then, over the past couple or so decades, have some churches of Christ abandoned anti-instrument doctrine? Anti-instrumental brethren may insist that such churches have been corrupted by false doctrine, that they are playing a fast and loose game of church growth at the expense of truth and faithfulness to God. To the contrary, brethren who have abandoned anti-instrumentalism insist that they no longer find anti-instrumental doctrine to be biblically sound or compelling. As a result of this doctrinal shift, some churches remain a cappella in their Sunday morning services but no longer teach anti-instrumentalism. For these non-instrumental brethren, their keeping to an a cappella format is more of a matter of preference, expedience, and tradition. It is not a matter of salvation. It is not a condition for fellowship. On some occasions, these non-instrumental churches of Christ may hold events that feature a praise team of vocalists and musicians that leads the gathering in hymns sung a cappella and then newer worship anthems along with instrumental accompaniment. These events provide an opportunity for a church's musicians and vocalists to serve in a meaningful and encouraging way that is not normally available to them on Sunday morning. These type of events offer occasions to connect with other believers and even seekers in the larger community. That is, those who are more drawn to a praise band-led live music worship event as a meaningful and inspiring experience. Such events provide opportunities for expanded fellowship, making encouraging connections with other believers, and exposing more people to sound New Testament teaching that they can find to be encouraging, helpful, sensible, informative, and instructive for their own walks of faith. Now, there have also been a number of churches of Christ that have gone even further. These continue to offer a cappella worship on Sundays. They also offer an instrumental service later on Sunday or on Saturday evenings. Some refer to this as a both-and approach, that is, being both non-instrumental and instrumental by offering two different weekly worship services. Of course, this is a more labor-intensive endeavor, but the reported results have been growing congregations and more baptisms.